Massachusetts resident. I'm also the director of research at Park. We're a healthcare advocacy organization, thankfully on the front lines of putting an end to the madness that you just heard about. In addition to hearing stories like the one that Simon just shared, I think it's very important that people understand the quote unquote science of pediatric gender medicine because unfortunately, no matter what side of this issue you're on, you have heard a refrain that this is evidence-based medicine, that it's necessary, that it saves lives, and unfortunately, none of that is true. And I want you to understand why that is. So for some background, about 15 years ago, US health providers began medically transitioning children with gender dysphoria. This can vary a little bit depending on what age the person starts receiving treatment, but generally this looks like a regimen where the child begins with puberty suppression, which can occur as early as Tanner stage 2, sometimes when the child is 8 or 9 years old, progressing onto pro-sex hormones, often around the age of 14 to 16, surgeries, which typically occur 18 or later, but in some cases, unfortunately, earlier, like Chloe Bolton you mentioned, who received her double mastectomy at 15. At the outset, when US clinicians started doing this, there was really scant evidence to justify the practice. The evidence that did exist came from the Netherlands, who were the pioneers in this practice. They transitioned a small number of minors using the same process and did observe some improvements in their self-reported mental health. And the logic for doing this was that mental health didn't appear to improve much in adults who were transitioning. So the hope or the expectation was if you do it in kids, it would make it easier for them to pass, and that therefore they would have better mental health outcomes. So say what you will about what's called the Dutch protocol, right? But I want you to understand also there's a difference between what they did in the Netherlands and what's happening in the United States right now. So in the Netherlands, for example, that original protocol required a childhood onset of gender dysphoria. So the child would have been having to raise those feelings for a number of years. In the United States, guidelines do not clarify that, and unfortunately now there are several whistleblower accounts that reveal a child receiving puberty blockers after a single visit with a clinician. The Dutch protocol required age 12 for the initiation of puberty blockers. The American guidelines, specifically from the Endocrine Society, endorse Tanner stage 2, as I mentioned, which is often as early as age 8 or 9. The Dutch protocol required patients to be psychologically stable and not suffer from other mental health problems. The United States does not use this same logic, and unfortunately, if you meet with other detransitioners or even unfortunately other kids who are still stuck in this, you'll understand that unfortunately a lot of them are not in sound mental health. So there's a few studies that have been foundational in trying to justify or rationalize this practice. And I want you to understand what those studies are, what they purport to reveal, and why you should be skeptical of the results. So perhaps the most important at this point, just because of where it was published, is psychosocial functioning in transgender youth after 2 years of hormones. And that was published last year in the New England Journal of Medicine by local doctors. The methodology in this study is to administer mental health questionnaires before the kids initiate hormone therapy, and then again at 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and 24 months. When they do this, they see very modest improvements in self-reported mental health. And so for that reason, they declare victory and say that this is a safe and effective medical practice. But there are a lot of flaws here. Most importantly, and I can't emphasize just how important this is, there is no control or comparison group. To practice evidence-based medicine, you have to have ideally what would be called a control group, meaning it's a randomized control trial. And if you don't have that, you should at least have a comparison group. In this case, perhaps young kids with similar mental health challenges to those who are undergoing treatment. So, imagine a scenario where perhaps you want to lose some weight and you start taking diet pills, right? Well, if we measure your weight 6 months later, whatever your weight is, isn't necessarily just the effect of the diet pills alone. You're being conscientious about your weight, you're purposely eating better, you're exercising. And so that's the same logic here. Whatever changes occur after the kids start hormones or puberty blockers cannot be attributed to the treatment itself. It just cannot. Okay? Beyond that, for unexplained reasons, some collected data is not published, which, given the other methodological concerns here, is probably not a coincidence. Researchers gloss over the fact that in a sample of 315 young people, 2 of them committed suicide. Unfortunately, that's just treated as missing data, which is pretty dark. The benefits were limited to natal females, and this has come up in other studies as well. There is a known antidepressant effect of testosterone, and that should raise the question of whether these people that claim to be benefiting are benefiting because of the resolution of their dysphoria or because of the known antidepressant effects of testosterone. This is kind of a technical point, but data windorization, the data at what's called at the extremes, so the 5th and 95th percentile, they pull those back so that the values are equal to the 5th and 95th percentile and can't fall below or above that. That's perhaps justifiable, but I will say as a researcher, I would want to see what the data looks like without that decision, which is never revealed. And then at the end, a lack of clinical significance. This is what they're talking about. This is how they're justifying the practice. So the orange line there is the group that initiated hormones early in puberty, and the blue line is those who did it later in puberty. And a lower score would be better on this anxiety scale, but when you look at how flat those lines are, this is essentially a meaningless clinical significance. Another foundational study, Turbin et al. 2020, pubertal suppression for transgender youth and risk of suicidal ideation, published in the journal Pediatrics. In the methodology, they survey trans-identified adults about their mental health. They compare the outcomes in those who claim to receive blockers in childhood versus those that did not receive blockers. They claim, based on this methodology, that children who receive puberty blockers are less likely to experience suicidal ideation as adults. Again, the flaws in this study should make people extremely skeptical. Data is taken from a 2015 survey that is completely unreliable. For example, most respondents who claim they took blockers reported starting after the age of 18. The point of blockers is to suppress puberty. No one is taking them after the age of 18. If they claim that, they're not understanding what they're answering. I believe that was actually 75% of the sample that they end up throwing out for that reason. But that doesn't magically make the 25 remaining percent of the sample worthwhile. Essentially, this was a survey of that should not be interpreted for anything involving medicine. Even, and like that alone should be a reason to just not trust this study at all. But even beyond that, it's worth considering patients with the most severe mental health conditions would have been restricted from receiving blockers. And so the fact that those who claim that they received blockers are now doing better as adults, well, they were also doing better as kids. So that probably has nothing to do with the blockers. Also, the survey sample was reached through advocacy orgs. So compared to the general population of gender-distressed youth, those in the surveys are more politically active and possibly aware that the responses are going to be used for political advocacy. So if the name Jamie Reed is familiar to anyone in this room, she was a famed whistleblower at a gender clinic in Missouri. I spoke to her about this recently, this last point. Simon, you and I were just talking about this. A lot of these kids who claim that they're doing better, from an objective viewpoint, are doing worse. They're not coming out of their room, they're dropping out of school, they're disengaged. They understand, however, that their responses on this are going to be used by these advocacy organizations to justify the practice, and that they want to convince their parents and their clinicians that they've made the right decision about these irreversible changes. And so unfortunately, a lot of this data, this self-reported mental health data, is just not reliable. Finally, there's this study from Tordov et al. 2022, mental health outcomes in transgender non-binary youth receiving gender-affirming care, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. In this one, they survey minors in a gender clinic about their mental health at time zero, in other words, right before they take hormones. 3 months in, 6 months in, and again at 12 months. They compare the trends of those who received hormones versus those who did not. They claim that receipt of blockers and hormones is associated with better mental health. And to their credit, I suppose the way that they do this is that they actually do have something resembling a comparison group, which is those kids in the gender clinic who did not receive blockers. But there are still enormous problems. For one, it's not a great sign that mental health is not improving in the treatment group at all. It's completely flat. Moreover, that deterioration in the group that did not receive blockers probably isn't because they didn't receive blockers. It's because in order to receive them, you have to meet a certain minimum threshold of mental functioning. In other words, those kids in the comparison group weren't getting worse because they didn't get blockers. They were getting worse because these were really mentally distressed kids. Finally, there is large attrition in the comparison group, such that only 6 of the original 92 are included in the study at the end. That reflects a combination of kids who are initially in that comparison group entering the treatment group once they're cleared for meeting those mental health thresholds, or just leaving the gender clinic altogether. But either way, that is such, where it's 90% attrition or whatever that is, makes the result essentially impossible to interpret. So you might be looking at these flaws and at these studies and thinking, well, that makes sense, but still, certainly the fact that the weight of the evidence seems to speak to benefit, perhaps that means something. All 3 of these studies might have issues, but they're all claiming there's some benefit there. I want to tell you, you should be extremely, extremely skeptical of that. That consensus is a mirage. And it's upheld by censorship and spin. So when I say censorship, a good example of this is a paper by Lisa Littman at Elizabeth Brown University on what's called rapid onset gender dysphoria. And there are people on the other side of this issue, unfortunately, who are just claiming that this is not a real phenomenon. But Littman had the courage to publish on it in a major journal, documenting, I think, probably what we all know to be true, which is that rapid onset gender dysphoria is, in fact, a real phenomenon. Despite the fact that her methodology was sound, unlike these other papers that I just discussed, there was such outrage that the paper forced her to issue corrections over really minor and trivial things, essentially their way of apologizing to the activists who were upset she would dare say this. And then more recently, actually, it was just last week or 2 weeks ago, Johanna Olsen Kennedy, who is the leader of the gender clinic at UCLA, admitted to a reporter from the New York Times that she was not going to be publishing a paper that she was supposed to be publishing, despite receiving a $10 million grant from the NIH, because she feared that the results were going to hurt her cause. And so that's a way of saying that this person is not interested in evidence-based medicine or science, but that this person, like these other folks who I was just talking about, are activists. Finally, even beyond what gets published and what does not, there's an issue of spin, how we talk about the results. So for the first time ever, there was a randomized control trial, the results of which were published last year at Nolan et al. 2023, where this was in Australia, but patients were randomly assigned either that they could receive, I believe it was top surgery, essentially fast-tracked. No, I'm sorry, it was not top surgery, it was hormones, that they were either fast-tracked or that they would have to wait 3 months. And what they saw was that there was more mental health improvement in those individuals who were allowed to start hormones immediately rather than wait 3 months. But and that's celebrated by the authors as a victory, evidence that in fact this is making people better. But the reality is actually the opposite. The physiological changes of hormones aren't manifesting within 3 months. And so if they're claiming that they're doing better, actually that's evidence of a placebo effect. They think they're doing better because they think that they're receiving the things that they need. Or perhaps what I alluded to earlier with women receiving testosterone and the antidepressant effects of testosterone. But either way, that has nothing to do with physiological changes. So the fact that that is held up as some sort of of victory is a real problem. Um, there's also evidence that it's just entirely fabricated. It's hard to get into the details of this, but this was a study that was published 2 years ago claiming that based on internet searches, they were seeing increased searches of suicide and suicidality in states that were restricting pediatric sex trait modification. And when you actually look at the raw data, it is so tortured that it just strains any and all credibility. So it's not only that they were slightly wrong, I mean, this is just a whole cloth fabrication. And yet it was published in a major journal. I contacted those journal editors immediately to explain how this was a fabrication. I know of other researchers who contacted them immediately to explain it was a fabrication. And yet if you look, there's no retraction or correction. That study is still there. And so when we talk about, how this mirage is held up, this is what it is, right? It's activists pretending to be scientists. It's censorship of anyone who disagrees, and it's spin on the results, which really do not justify this practice. The truth is, there's reasons I believe that this is causing more harm than good. I can't prove that one way or another, just as someone on the other side can't prove that it's causing more good than harm. But these are the red flags, and these are the reasons why I suspect the harm outweighs the benefit. Number one is the European mechanisms. If you follow this issue at all, there have been systematic evidence reviews in Sweden, Finland, and the United Kingdom, where they really look at the weight and the quality of evidence. So rather than just wave one study around and say, this is evidence-based medicine, they really open up the books and interrogate it. And in those three countries, which I think it's fair to say are three of the most socially liberal countries in the entire world, their conclusion was that the risk of harm is equal to or exceeds the benefit. And so they have really, really pulled back on this. Not banned altogether, but it is limited to clinical research settings, which means A, it's just very hard to access for kids, and B, that unlike here in the United States, they're actually trying to collect good data on this and understand what's going on. Second, the proliferation of gender ideology, by which I mean succinctly the belief that gender is an abstraction or an idea and not biology. When I was a kid, when I was in kindergarten, nobody asked me what my pronouns were. I was a boy, I understood I was a boy, there was no doubt about that whatsoever. Now, unfortunately, for these little kids, through the power of suggestion, this is something that they start to question immediately. What do you mean, what are my pronouns? Is it possible to be something other than a boy or girl? And so the reality is that we are sort of prodding kids into this. And so when we talk about the Dutch results from the 1990s, they didn't have this ideology built around it. And so I believe actually it's possible that maybe those kids benefited because they kind of arrived there on their own rather than from the cradle learning these ideas that they might be something other than a boy or girl. There's also clear evidence of social contagion. Again, there are some people who deny this, but I don't even know how that's possible. If you have a child in school at all, or know a teacher who's in middle school, classes of 20 kids where you'll have a cohort of 5 young girls approaching their teacher and declaring that they are transgender or gender nonconforming. That's statistically impossible, right? So it's very, very obvious that social contagion is a factor in all of this. Whistleblower accounts. I mentioned Jamie Reed before, but also people who have gone through the process saying that they were prescribed puberty blockers or hormones immediately and on demand, and that there's no child safeguarding whatsoever. Leora Sapir wrote a few months ago in City Journal about a case of a nonverbal autistic child who was medicalized. That's not right. High rates of desistance in dysphoria. So there are studies from the past that tracked kids with gender dysphoria who were not medicalized, and that would have been actually before they were doing this to children, and they saw that on average something like 4 in 5 of those kids would desist in their dysphoria after puberty. I think that 80% estimate now probably is actually a very serious undercount, right? Because that was really done before we saw the the rapid spread of gender ideology and much more intense medicalization. So, if it was 80% then, maybe it's 95 to 99% now. And then finally, and this is moving sort of beyond data, but understanding that we're not just talking about, we're not just talking about data and science. We're talking about real people. So that Simon, as awful as what it is that you went through, I mean, for some people who went down the medical pathway, they will never be right again. It is very traumatic what they went through. This is real iatrogenic harm. These are pretty primitive medical interventions that we're talking about. Hormones are associated with increased risk of certain cancers, heart disease, obesity. For the surgeries themselves, we're talking about inverting a penis and creating an open wound in a person. This is, unless for those adults for whom it's absolutely necessary, not a great way to live your life. And so, with all of this in mind, and given the lack of evidence to justify this, really the only sensible solution is to restrict this to people under the age of 18. So, thank you.